Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley. This is History for Thinkers. Welcome to part number 2 of the Kampf analysis series. I strongly encourage you to watch it all the way through so you can get like a chronological view on what Kampf is. But I'm not here to tell you how to live your life, so if you want to start on episode 2, by all means be my guest. Now, I do want to have a little disclaimer here. This translation is different from the one I was using in the first episode. Now, the reason for that is because that previous translation I was using by Murphy, which is like one of the first translations of Mein Kampf ever into English, it did not have page numbers on the PDF, which kind of got irritating. So I found this translation, which is the most widely cited by scholars translations of Mein Kampf that is available. It's translated by a man, I believe his name was Walter Mannerheim, and so it's reputable. They are both legit translations. This one just happens to have page numbers, so I think they're both great, but I'm going with this one for the sake of this series. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get right into the analysis. To study history means to search for and discover the forces that are the causes of those results which appear before our eyes as historical events. The art of reading and studying consists in remembering the essentials and forgetting what is not essential. And I just think this is such a good idea right here. Regardless of where it came from, it's like, yeah, we should remember what is important and forget what isn't. And I think so few people have practically applied that to studying history. I think they're, especially with like our modern internet culture, like you can just go down such rabbit holes and know so much that means nothing. Like you could be an expert on something like medieval tax law. Like it does not matter. It provides zero value if you cannot like apply that to something in some way, shape, or form. And seeing such a powerful and coherent idea come from someone as insane as Hitler is a little jarring. And I'm sure it's not going to be the only good idea he has throughout Mein Kampf. So, like, this is like, again, one of these reasons that I think having an analysis and breakdown of Hitler in his own words is so important. Like, we get this comic book cartoon villain in our heads that, like, that's what everyone in the West, especially a place like America, that's what we think Hitler is. Just this crazy, curling his mustache, kind of guy. And he was actually a really smart person. Like, all evil aside, very, very capable. And I think that's a side of Hitler that we neglect way too much. And stuff like this kind of puts it at the forefront of our mind. So, rant over, we'll continue the analysis. So this very next little paragraph here from about right here onto the next page, he talks about one of his professors that he had and how he was just this really great history professor and how he was the guy that I think he even says the name somewhere in here, that this man, this history professor, Dr. Leopold Pocht. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. I know it's wrong. But this guy was the reason that Hitler got interested in history. It's always interesting. And how he goes on and elaborates how, well, being a fan of history, understanding the history of the German people, well, that turned him into a rebel and an enemy of the state. Again, living in Austria, he stood against the House of the Habsburg in favor of, uniting the German people, right? It's not about any personal interests or money or religion or anything else. It's all about us people, our people. So here's a good little sentence. In the North and in the South, the poison of foreign races was eating into the body of our people. I just, pay attention to the words that he's using here. The poison of foreign races. I mean, these people are not just useless, but they are dangerous. And this is something that he wholeheartedly believed. I mean, there was just no redeeming quality about anyone of any other race. And it's obvious throughout the entire book that he definitely feels that way, but I think this is actually the first time throughout the book he said something like that. And it's just such charged language that you cannot help but to think like, wow, this is insane. The poison of foreign races, like they're just toxic. Like just being around them kills you. I mean, what an insane world to live in. And Hitler has no love for the Slavs because he will talk about the events of World War I quite a bit. And he mentions how the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the guy who was assassinated by the Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip, that caused World War I, which was at least one of like the big major events that caused it. Well, he says that Franz Ferdinand was, trying to make Austria a Slav state. And it's only ironic that, the very bullets which he himself had helped to cast, right? So he's kind of like, well, you get what you get. That's what happens when you favor another race. Really, that's the way he saw the world. That's why he's using words like poison to describe foreign races. So whenever you hear someone say something like this, dismiss whatever their opinion is immediately. So this is what Hitler says. Suffice it to say here that in the very early years of my youth, I came to certain conclusions which I have never abandoned. That screams that I have never challenged my own ideas. I've never been exposed to someone's opinion that went against my own. I never tried to get outside of my own head. That is what that says. And just think about that, right? I mean, he's writing this in prison or, I don't think he really specifies exactly when he came to these conclusions, but whatever these conclusions were, I mean, it's like someone that was really young that made these conclusions, pretty naive. They don't really understand the world. And to cling on to those ideas is just kind of goofy. If you think the exact same things that you thought when you were 15 years old, you are failing because you are not challenging yourself. You're not reading new material. You're just not expanding your view of the world. And he mentions specifically what some of these conclusions were, right? He wants the Austrian Empire to dissolve. He also thinks that is the only thing that's going to secure the defense of Germany. Now, to give credit where credit is due, he does mention that the House of Habsburg was destined to bring misfortune to the German nation. Not entirely inaccurate, although I think that the House of Habsburg, you can make an argument that they were not good for any race, just inserting that it was the German nation alone. They probably weren't that good for Slavic independence either. But he doesn't mention that because guess what? Slavs aren't humans, right? So anyway, moving on. And he mentions his father's death over around in this paragraph. And I just think it's interesting because he kind of makes it out like his father wanted what was best for him. But I just don't think that Hitler was all that saddened or hurt by his father's death because, well, they had all of this confrontation between the two of them. I mean, Hitler's dad, Alois, made life living hell for his son. He was just this horrible father. I mean, we can talk about all of his character flaws, like cheating on his wife and sleeping around and all these other kids and beating the kids that he had and just all kinds of horrible stuff. But when he died, what it allowed Hitler to do, Adolf Hitler, is that he was now able to just sit around and not go to school and appreciate art. That is pretty much what he did. He lived with his mom, didn't really do much. He was basically a NEET, not employed in education or training. He was just hanging out, having a grand old time, going to the opera, appreciating painting and, the kinds of things that you would expect. So he mentions that he had some kind of lung infection, that the doctors advised his mother not to send him to the Realschule, which was basically the more practical path to become a civil servant, which is what his father had wanted. Like, his mom still wanted to go through with that. But I guess these doctors said, yeah, you can't really do it. It's not good for Hitler's health. So for some reason, she allowed him to go to the academy, right? So he was pretty much just hanging out for a couple of years. Like I said, appreciating art. And you can even hear how much he misses those times. He's like, those were happy days, which appeared to me almost as a dream, but they were bound to remain only a dream. Interesting. I always find whenever someone has that phase in their life where, like, they just don't really do anything, or they're just hanging out, or, they're not doing what needs to be done. Like, people always look back like, yeah, those were great times. Like, and just seeing Hitler do that, it's just kind of weird. It isn't very long that his mom gets sick, she dies, and then he says this really interesting line right here. I respected my father, but I loved my mother. Really gives you some insight onto the kind of relationship he had with his parents. I think that his father was a tyrant, and his mother was probably a good mom, but should have stood up to her husband. Well, then he also mentions, poverty and stern reality forced me to decide promptly. Well, we're pretty sure, like, from the historical sources that I've read, that he was never really, like, destined to be poor. I mean, he had an orphanage income. He also had other family members that helped out when they could. Like, he could have been okay. The allowance which came to me as an orphan was not enough for the bare necessities of life. Again, like, it just kind of comes down to what kind of standard of living are you indulging in? Are you spending like a third of your income going to the opera to appreciate the music? With my clothes and linen packed in a valise, and with an indomitable resolution in my heart, I left for Vienna. I mean, it's just so dramatic. He also leaves out so much detail. I mean, he leaves with one of his best friends, right? And someone else we've talked a lot about on this channel, August Kubizek. And he doesn't even mention that. He just wants to make it out like he's this lone, going out to strive and achieve, right? He kind of turns his life into this narrative, which, I mean, turning your life into a narrative is not necessarily a bad thing, but he just leaves out so much. He makes it out to be like, he just exaggerates to the point where I think he crosses that line into dishonesty and maybe even straight up lying. So he talks about applying to the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna. He gets rejected from the painting class, the painting program, and they're basically like, yeah, you really have an aptitude for architecture. But here was the problem. He did not have the leaving certificate from the middle school. So he could not apply because he just didn't have the qualification that was necessary. So he was in a really rough position there. Really, I bet you wished didn't leave school so early. Now, I think this little paragraph really embodies this transformation that he goes through, because now he's in Vienna, he's been rejected, and he leaves his best friend and he basically becomes homeless. And then he says this about it. I am thankful for that period of my life because it hardened me and enabled me to be as tough as I am now. And I am even more thankful because I appreciate the fact that I was thus saved from the emptiness of a life of ease, and that a mother's darling was taken from tender arms and handed over to adversity as to a new mother. That is such a good quote. I mean, I think number one, it really shows you how he tries to dramatize his own life. I mean, this isn't this is what happened to me and this is what happened. This is more like a dramatic retelling. This is the Hollywood picturesque version, right? I always think that's kind of funny. And secondly, I think this really shows how, for all the things that were wrong with Hitler, and I feel the need to have that disclaimer in there, right? Like, it's hard to say something good about Hitler as a person or as a character because, like, it's just like, oh, whoa, right? But I do think that it really shows a mature way to view his own past. And I think that is something that we should all kind of strive for, to look back on a horrible phase in our life and be like, you know what? Things were pretty bad, but I'm a lot tougher as a result of it. And I'm thankful that I had the opportunity to go through adversity that I could survive and grow from. So you have this really interesting little section that's really profound and very mature and really well thought out. And then he goes on, he's like, "It was during this period that my eyes were opened to two perils, the names of which I scarcely knew hitherto, and had no notion whatsoever of their terrible significance for the existence of the German people. These two perils were Marxism and Judaism." So I just imagine some young, homeless Austrian guy just wandering around the reason I'm homeless? The communists and the Jews. That's why. That's almost the way it happens in his own mind. And it's just almost comical, right? How do you get to that conclusion? Very interesting. So he talks about how he makes his way as a day laborer, earning his own bread. And then he says that all his free time was spent studying. And I don't know. I think that's too idealistic. I think even the most disciplined person needs to have some fun. All the free time after work was devoted exclusively to study. Probably not. Especially, how did you even have enough money to buy these books? What were you studying? I don't think he ever mentions that. So it's kind of sketchy. It's one of those things you kind of have, you read it and then you really think about it and you're like, oh, he was probably reading some other crazy ranting conspiracy theorist. And then again, he says something that I think tells you so much. Since then, I have extended that foundation, his worldview, really, the shape of his mind, only very little, and I have changed nothing in it. So again, does not challenge his own beliefs. He doesn't think about things. He doesn't play devil's advocate. So for a couple of pages here, he rambles on for a really long time about the country guy going to a big city. He talks about unemployment, all these people trying to find work. He also talks about the people who are not impoverished and looking for work themselves. And he kind of makes a serious judgment call on those people. And he basically says, listen, if you've never been that impoverished, homeless guy that can't find a job, you cannot say anything about him because you just don't know what it's like. You don't know that demon until you've lived with him. And I think that's a really interesting point to make because, there's probably some truth to that, right? I think it's really hard to sympathize with and understand a really difficult position that people find themselves in if you haven't lived it. You can try to understand, but at the end of the day, you just don't. You're not part of that group of people. But you gotta take the other side of the argument too and really think about, well, how many of these poor, impoverished people actually climb their way out of that position to even, have an opinion on the matter, right? Most of those people, they don't have time to sit around and talk about politics or what should or shouldn't be done. They're just out there trying to find work, and they probably will be for the rest of their lives. So that's just an interesting conversation. And his idea that, you rich, wealthy, affluent people, you don't really know what you're talking about. Interesting idea, and I don't know, I just think it's unique that he feels that way about it. So he spends a really long time, at least a couple of pages here, talking about how horrible it is for the homeless people, the impoverished people in Vienna, the day laborers, how, he saw countless times where there would be a day laborer and he's got a family at home And sometimes he gets his paycheck, doesn't feed his family, and just goes out and spends it, drinks, whatever it is. And it is really sad because I'm sure a lot of that was going on. It's really hard to see there being genuine intention. I think he's talking about that to kind of be like, yeah, well, I was suffering with them and me and the poor people, man. And I think it kind of creates this image that is very favorable for Hitler. And again, we cannot forget, this is a political manifesto. So he's talking about these, poor homeless people for a very long time for a reason. There is a calculated reason that he's talking about this for so long, for as many pages as he is. And of course, here we bring it to the political, right? He brings this, okay, what is going on here? What's the problem? Oh, okay, that's the problem. Here's my solution. Here's how we fix this. So he says, during my struggle for existence in Vienna, I perceived very clearly that the aim of all social activity must never be merely charitable relief, which is ridiculous and useless, but it must rather be a means to find a way of eliminating the fundamental deficiencies in our economic and cultural life. Deficiencies which necessarily bring about the degradation of the individual, or at least lead him towards such degradation. So this sounds pretty specific, but here's the problem. He can entirely define what does the degradation of the individual exactly mean, right? Because we also know that he was someone who was opposed to free and open markets, right? So global trade, trading with neighboring nations, international trade, so things like that. He's opposed to that. Is that degradation? Or does it only apply to small town? I mean, what he's saying doesn't actually sound all that bad. The problem is in how you define some of the words in this sentence, right? Because, if you define degradation as someone of two different races being friends, well, there you go. It's we got to eliminate that from society. So it's there you go. I think there's also a grain of truth when he says that charitable relief is ridiculous and useless. I think in a lot of cases, probably yes, especially on large scale, right? When you get these behemoth charities that they just go out and feed a gazillion people and they do all this good, what they're really doing in a lot of times is that they're actually making problems worse. And I think the Africa example really comes to mind, where a lot of wealthy Western nations, they come together, they get all this money, they get all this food, they send it over to Africa, in the hopes of doing something good, let's feed some people, let's save some lives. They do that. And then, what does it really do? Well, it just makes Africa dependent on food coming in, because guess what? The local farmers, the African farmers, they can't compete with free. So why would you buy, especially if you're a poor country, right? Why would you buy stuff that, if you can get it for free, you're poor, right? So it's just you cannot compete with free. It just does not work. So I think on that basis, you can attack charitable relief, because I know the Africa example is not the only time that happens. I think that's actually fairly common with large scale charitable relief. But I think on a smaller scale, right? If you do it person to person, individual to individual, I think that's actually a lot more effective. You can't really do a tax write-off with that though, so people don't really do that as much. But that's a topic for another time. So here's a really scary little passage. When the individual is no longer burdened with his own consciousness of blame in this regard, then and only then will he have the inner tranquility and outer force to cut off drastically and ruthlessly all the parasite growth and root out the weed. Or the weeds. Sorry. So, really, it's not, at the end of the day, it's not about the individual making choices and being responsible for those choices. It's about, listen, man, the state, someone else has got to come in, make these decisions for them. I mean, burdened with his own consciousness of blame. Like, how can you even say something like that? I mean, man, you're burdened by the ability to make decisions. You know, it's like, so, and of course he blames the Austrian state as being, well, they're just not adequate in solving these problems. So all of these horrible things, they just run amok because the Austrian state, they just don't care enough to do anything about it. And I think this is one of those principles of collectivist ideologies that is so dangerous. There is no individual responsibility. You, as a unit of whatever it may be, whether it's your religion, your race, your gender, whatever it is, you are responsible for everything that group does. Extremely dangerous idea. Because, I mean, it can just be, it's so broadly applied. I mean, imagine all humans shared some kind of collective responsibility for everything in human history. Like, it would just be a crazy idea. It's like, well, you're human. Charles Manson was also human, so you're evil. I mean, like, that's the kind of logic that goes along with this kind of thinking. Like, it's just insane when you really think about it. So here's an interesting little rant further on down. I'm not going to read the entire thing. I think it's really useful to do so, though. I'll just give you the little highlight down here. So he says, the French boy is not educated on purely objective principles. Wherever the importance of the political and cultural greatness of his country is concerned, he is taught in the most subjective way that one can imagine. So listen, man, France over there, they are winning. They do great. We should take their subjective education and do more of that. We should be emulating this subjective experience. We don't want a relationship with objective reality. Forget about that, man. Forget about that. We want a subjective interpretation of our own history. That's what he's saying right there. That's his argument. And when you put it that way, it's like, oh, well, yeah, that can be kind of dangerous, can it? It's just, and you know, he just lays it out like right here. I mean, I don't know. It's just kind of crazy to read, honestly. And I think the real problem with it is that it allows your nation state to perpetrate horrible, horrible crimes. I mean, if you're only going to give him like the good version of what happened, well, like, of course. I mean, you have to think about the way, right? Imagine a scenario where the Axis powers win World War II, or at the very least, it's some kind of stalemate, right? Both sides say, you know what? Enough people have died, let's call it quits, but the Nazi government stays in power. How would they have spun the Holocaust? I mean, how do you put a friendly face on that? That is exactly, like, that's the kind of thing he's talking about right here. Do not be objective, do not be truthful, do not give them a reality. Give them this subjective BS lie, this narrative that will make them loyal to this state. So dangerous. So dangerous. And ideas like that are really what make it all possible. This is why governments are able to do some of the horrible things that they do, because like they're just not going to give you the objective truth. They're going to give you like the watered down version. I mean, and this happens in just about every country or even people group that you can imagine. Partly because they are like knowingly and consciously doing it, but I think on another level, if you have someone that loves their homeland, whether it's France or Germany or the US or, you know, wherever else, I think if you buy into it and you're going to seek out confirmation bias. So not only do you may you have been lied to, right? Like that, which is totally a possibility. Even in America, where we kind of go hard on, yeah, our ancestors killed people and like stole a continent and like enslaved people. Like we do that a lot. And it still might be like the watered down version. It still might not be the whole truth, which is like such a scary thought. But even if you're someone who thinks that they have like a good relationship with the truth or objective reality, you still might just the facts might just not exist. You might not even find a source that can, lead credence to a theory or whatever. The reason that we know about the Holocaust is because the Allies won World War II. We in this scenario where the Axis powers won, it just wouldn't have happened. It's just not part of history. It's not even a footnote. It just didn't happen. And that is exactly what you get when you want the state to be subjective, when you want history to be subjective. Objectivity may lead you to some really uncomfortable places. It may not be the greatest strategy long term, but it will never take you to a concentration camp. I think that's actually a really good place to leave off. So thank you so much for listening all the way through. Part 3 will be coming shortly. My name is Michael McCauley at History for Thinkers. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.